Amazon DynamoDB Transactions simplifies the developer experience of making all or nothing changes to multiple items within and across tables. DynamoDB Transactions provides read and write APIs to manage complex business workflows as a single all or nothing operation. In this video, let's learn how to start using the transaction write items and use it when building .NET applications. Hello everyone, my name is Rahul and welcome back to this YouTube channel. If you're new here, I make videos on .NET, Cloud and DevOps. This video is sponsored by AWS and is part of my .NET on AWS series. Transactions provide atomicity, consistency, isolation and durability, commonly referred to as ACID in database land. This helps you to maintain data correctness in your applications. Now, with DynamoDB, there is no additional cost to enable transactions. However, you need to note one thing. You pay for the reads and writes that are as part of your transactions. Now, with DynamoDB, it performs two underlying reads or writes for every item in the transaction. So one is to prepare the transaction and the other one to commit the transaction. This means essentially you're paying double the cost in usual scenarios. So make sure you're using transactions when they are absolutely necessary for your business case and the applications that you're building. You can also model the data in such a way that you can avoid transactions if it isn't absolutely necessary. The TransactWriteItems is a synchronous and idempotent write operation that groups up to 100 write actions in a single all or nothing operation. Now, these 100 should be distinct items and can target one or more Dynamo tables within the same AWS account and in the same region. Now, the aggregate size of the items should also not exceed 4 MB. The actions that you can do inside the transaction are put, update, delete, and also a condition check. We will see on how to use some of these in a demo in our application. So let's switch over to Rider and see some of these in action. So here I have an existing application set up. This is a console application which has the AWS DynamoDB SDK already set up and installed. Now, if you're completely new to DynamoDB, I highly recommend checking out my video on getting started, which will be linked here and also in the descriptions below. So let's navigate to program.cs. So here it creates an Amazon DynamoDB client, which is the lower level API. Now, to work with transactions in this example, I will use the lower level API. You can also achieve this using the higher level DynamoDB context, but some of the features are limited, which we have seen in the other videos in our DynamoDB series. So once we have the client created, we are using the client to set up the demo tables that's required for this application. So inside here, I am creating the multiple tables that's required, which is the order, customer table, and also the product catalog table, which sets up some of the demo tables that's required for this demo. For this demo, we will explore the same example that's mentioned in the DynamoDB documentation. So here we have the customer, product catalog, and orders tables, which manages data about the products that's available and also customer details and orders that's being placed. So let's look at a scenario on how to use DynamoDB transactions to coordinate multiple steps that's required to create and process an order. Using a single all or nothing operation ensures that if any of the transaction fails, no actions in the transaction are run and no changes are made. So let's see this in example. So inside here, we are using the e-commerce operations to set up those demonstration tables. So I am setting up the order table, the customer table, and also the product catalog table. I'm also populating some of the product catalog, which we will be using to buy in our orders. Now, this has the fields product ID, the name, a price, and also the quantity, which is the number of items that's available for sale. So let's navigate back to our program.cs and see how we can start processing some orders, which takes in the customer ID, the product ID, order ID, and also the quantity that's required. And it also has a DynamoDB client to perform the operations. Now, let's say to start with, we need to make an order. So we need to create the order in the table, and also we need to reduce the quantity from the product catalog. So based on this order quantity, we can do that. Now, since in this case, we are going to use the transaction write, let's explore the DynamoDB client, which exposes the transaction write items async method. So if we look at that, this takes in a TransactWriteItems request. So let's pass in the request and let's create the request right before this. So let's create a request. And let's create the new object, which is the TransactWriteItems request. Now, inside this requires the TransactWriteItems, which is going to be a list of items. So let's create the items, and let's again create the items parameter and create a list of TransactWriteItems. This is where we're going to pass in the different operations that's required for this transaction call. So to start with, we need to make sure that we are creating a new order. Now that's going to be a DynamoDB put operation, which we have seen in an earlier video, which will be linked here. So let's create a new TransactWriteItem, which is going to be a put operation. So let's select put in this case, and let's also create a new put request. Now this is going to create a new transaction write item with the put as the property, which will have the put object request. So here we'll have to specify the table name. In this case, this is going to put an item to the orders table. So let's specify orders. We also need to specify the item that needs to be put. So let's specify them as a key value pairs of dictionary string attribute value. Now, since I'm using the lower level APIs, I'll need to explicitly specify this. So let's specify the order ID, which is going to be the order ID that's going to come from our parameter. So let's specify this as an attribute value. So let's specify the S property, which is going to populate the string property for this, and specify order ID. So this is going to map the order ID parameter to that particular column. Now we have the order ID, so let's also specify the customer ID and a few other properties. So let me copy and paste them. So we have the customer ID, product ID, and also the quantity. All of these are coming from these function as parameters. So once we have inserted a record into the orders table, we need to make sure that we are also updating the product catalog table to reduce the quantity. So in this case, that's going to be an update because it's going to be an item that's going to be existing in that particular table. So let's create a new update request, and let's pass some of these properties again. So let me again copy and paste, and I'll walk you through the properties. So in this case, we are specifying the product catalog. We are specifying the keys, which is going to be the product ID in this case. So we're going to affect this specific key in this table. Now, in this case, we are setting an update expression, which is going to update the quantity on that particular item of that table. So here we are going to specify the quantity is going to be quantity minus the order quantity. So whatever is available, we are taking away the number of items that we have ordered so that only those many items are left for future orders. Now we are also passing the values, which is the order quantity, as an attribute value. So in this case, we're going to just pass the order quantity as a number type into this request. So once we have these two, we're going to successfully create an order and also reduce the number of items in the product catalog as a single all or nothing operation. So which means if any of the things fails in either of these requests, the whole thing will be rolled back. Now, if we navigate to our DynamoDB table, we can see I have already created these three tables by running this helper method, which has set up the tables. So if you use this sample code, it will automatically create the tables for you as long as you have the right permissions on your account set up. Now, inside the product catalog, we can see we already have three items, which is P1, P2, and P3, with some price and also the associated quantity. So let's buy the product 1 inside our code. So let's come back and let's set up this code to process some order. So let's specify process order. Let's specify the customer ID. So in this case, I'm going to specify C1. Let's specify the product ID as P1, and let's specify the order ID as O1. So once we have that, let's specify the quantity as 5. And we also need to pass the client, which is going to be the DynamoDB client. So let's await this, and we're going to create a new order. So inside our process order, it's going to process these parameters and create the order item. So let's make sure to await this call, which is going to call the TransactWriteItems. Now, inside the TransactWriteItems, if you want to see the amount of capacity that's consumed, you can specify the return consumed capacity and set that to be return consumed capacity dot total or the other properties that it supports. So let's put a breakpoint inside here. Now, since there is a possibility of this method throwing an exception in case any of the TransactWriteItem operations fail, let's make sure to try and catch this particular call. So let's wrap this with a try catch call, and let's make sure to handle the exception. So we can catch the transaction cancelled exception, which is going to get called if a transaction is going to get cancelled. So in this case, we can simply write the reason for this particular cancellation. So let's specify the exception and let's log that to our console. We can also catch generic exception, which is going to be catch an exception in general, and let's log that as well so that we have the details inside our console in case something goes wrong. So let's make sure to put a breakpoint in both of these so that we also know whenever this happens. Well, let's also capture the response right after the TransactWriteItems so that we can see the details of the response. Now, before I run this, I need to make sure that I'm passing the put and the update as two separate TransactWriteItems. I've accidentally put that in the same object. So let's make sure to change this into two separate objects. So let's create a new TransactWriteItem here and pass the update as a separate TransactWriteItem. So in this case, I'll have to add one more braces. And here we have the appropriate code. So we are creating two TransactItems and creating this list of TransactWriteItems inside that. So we can use the target typed in this specific case as well. So once we have these two new TransactItems, we can specify the put and the update, which is going to be one of those operations for each of those TransactWriteItems. So let's run this and see this in action. So here it has hit our TransactWriteItems, then this has the request, which is going to have two items inside that. So if you look at the TransactItems, we can see there's two requests. One is going to be the put request and the other one is going to be the update request. So let's make sure to continue this execution. Now this comes back with the response. So if I expand this, you can see the consumed capacity has two items and each of them has capacity units too. So in this case, there is two write capacity units that's getting used for that particular orders table. We can also see similarly for the other unit, which is on the product catalog, there is two capacity units used. So let's continue the execution. Now, if I navigate to our DynamoDB tables, so if I navigate back into the orders table and refresh and look at the table items, you can see we have a new order, which is on order 1 for C1 and P1 with a quantity of 5. Now, if I navigate into the product catalog and go to explore table items, we can see that the product 1 quantity is now set to 5. It was earlier 10, which is now 5 because 5 of them is only remaining. Now, if I run this application, so let's say in this case, we're going to create the order 2 for the same customer. And let's say this time we're going to make 6 quantities. So let's run this again and let's see what happens in this specific case. So let's run this again. So it's going to hit the product request and create the TransactWriteItems. Now the response has come back and this hasn't thrown an exception. So if I continue the execution, let's navigate back and refresh this. And here you can see that the quantity is now -1. So this is an invalid state for our application. So this means that we were able to make a request for this specific product even though it didn't have the required amount of quantities to be sold. So let's see how we can fix that. So if we switch back to our code, you can see inside our program, when we are setting the quantity, we are blindly setting that value. So in the update request, all we are doing is setting the update expression and setting the quantity by this value, which is why it is allowing it to be a negative value. So to make sure that does not happen, let's specify a condition expression as well on this update request. So in this case, we're going to specify the quantity should be greater than or equal to the order quantity. So we can specify the quantity greater than or equal and also specify the order quantity parameter. We can also enforce that this needs to be greater than 0 if that's required. So once we have set the condition expression, we can run this again. Before that, let's come back to our product 1 catalog and let's fix this numbers. So let's specify this to be back 3 again and let's save and close this item so that we have 3 of those items left. So if I come back, let's go to the P1 and if I'm still going to buy this 6 items in this specific case, it should throw an exception. This is because we don't have 6 items of that product to be sold. So if I run this is going to throw a transaction cancelled exception. Now in this case, you can look at the message. So if I look at the exception in this specific case, let's expand this and we can see the transaction was cancelled. Please refer to the cancellation reasons for specific reasons. So if I look at the cancellation reasons inside here, we can see there is 2 of these reasons and one of them should say the condition request failed. This is because the condition check that we just added has not passed. So if I run this, it's going to throw the exception and log that to our console. So let's make this 2 and run this again. Now in this case, since we have 2 items inside our product catalog for those items, it is going to successfully create that order and reduce the number. So if I switch back and refresh this again, you can see there's only 1 item left. Now, if any order makes one more request for this laptop, it is going to get passed. Otherwise, it's going to throw an error. Now, in all of these cases, when we created the order, you can see that we have the customer one being created. However, if we look at the customer table, we don't have any existing customers. So these orders are potentially created for customers which does not exist in our system. So let's see how we can ensure that the customer exists in this specific transaction. So if I come back to our transaction request items, we can create a new transaction request item into this collection. So let's create a new object. Now, in this case, since all we need to check is a condition on a table, we can use the condition check. So let's create a new condition check for this. So let's create that. Let's pass in the table name. So in this case, the table name is going to be our customer's table name. And all we need to check is that the customer exists in that specific table. So let me copy and paste the required properties. So let's specify that. So in this case, we're going to specify the key that is required, which is the customer ID. And all we need to do is the condition expression that customer ID exists in that table. Now, in our transaction, we have 3 items being done. So we do a condition check on the customer's table. We make sure that we update the product catalog, and we also create a new order item inside the orders table. Now let's run this again. So let's go and change the order number to 03, and let's make sure we buy only 1 item because that's the only number of items that's existing for that product. Now in this case, since the customer C1 does not exist inside our DynamoDB, it is going to throw a canceled exception. So if we further look at the exception, you can see the cancellation reason, and this time it will be a condition check that is failed on this specific table. So if you see condition check failed, and this is on the 3rd item inside our list. This is why the cancellation reason for 0 and 1 is none, because those two didn't have any cancellation reasons. So only the 3rd item inside our list has a condition check failed, which is why it is coming as the 3rd item inside the cancellation reasons list. So now if I go and fix that, so let's come back to our startup script inside the e-commerce operations. And if I uncomment this, which is going to populate some customer data, and let's run this again. So this is going to insert some customer details inside our tables. So let's run this application again. So let's make sure to put a breakpoint inside here and let's run this. Now this time the customer is going to exist in our table. So it's going to successfully create a new order. So let's continue this, and this comes back with a response, and we can see the consumed capacity has 3 items and each of these has 2 units being consumed. So we can see this has 2. The other one has 2, and there's 2 in the 3rd call as well. So if I continue this execution, come back to our table and refresh this, you can see there is the order 3 for customer 1. Now if I go to the product catalog, this item is now 0. So any more request to P1, it's going to fail again. Now with the TransactWriteItems call, you can ensure that a request is idempotent. So making your transaction idempotent helps prevent application errors if the exact same operation is submitted multiple times. Let's say this is happening due to a connection timeout or other issues inside your application code. So in these cases, if the original TransactWriteItems was successful, a TransactWriteItems call with the exact same client token that also gets returned successfully, but it does not make any changes underlying. But in this case, the return consumed capacity will still be used. However, it will only be the read units. Earlier in the cases, we saw that it was the write capacity units that was getting used. But if it is a subsequent idempotent call, then it will be the read capacity units. For idempotency, we need to make sure that we pass in an explicit client token. Now, this client token is only valid for 10 minutes. So during that time, if you use the exact same request with the same token, then it is going to return back a success without even doing anything in the DynamoDB table. Let's see this example. So if I come back to our call, inside our TransactWriteItems request that we are making, we can explicitly pass in a token. That is the client request token. Now, in this case, it makes sense to make the order ID as the token for us. So let's make sure that the order ID is getting passed as a token. Now, if I go and make a new order, so let's create an order 4 in this specific case, and let's also make this to be product 2. Now, I'm going to make only one item. So if I come back to our tables, we can see here we have 15 of these items of product 2, which is a smartphone. So let's come back. Let's run this. Let's make sure to put a breakpoint inside our request, and let's run this. Now this is going to create the response. So it's going to hit that. It's going to successfully do it. So let's continue the execution, and it's going to complete the order. So if I come back and refresh this, you can see here that the product 2 has one item reduced. We also have a new order, which is going to be the order 4 in this case, which is for product 2. Now, if I run this exact same request, because in this specific case, I'm not changing anything in this line. So let's run this again, and let's see what happens. Now, since the TransactWriteItem request has the exact same request inside this, it is going to return back a response. So if I expand that, you can see that the consumed capacity has 3. And if I expand that further, you can see this is now setting the read capacity units instead of the write capacity units. So you can see it's the same for all of these items inside that consumed capacity. Everything has just incurred a read because none of this was written to the table. This is because we have passed in the client request token, and the request is matching the exact same. So if I continue this execution, come back and refresh this, you can see there was no new orders created inside this table. Also, in the product catalog, you can see that the quantity is still 14. Now, if the request has changed slightly, so let's say we added a new attribute inside this. So let's specify this as date time. And let's assume we are going to pass in the datetime.now. So let's specify datetime.now.toString, and let's pass this value. So in this case, that's going to be a string. So let's pass that as a string. And let's run this again. Now, in this case, the request has slightly changed, even though request token is remaining exactly the same. Now, in this specific case, it's going to throw an exception, and it's throwing the exception that the idempotent parameter mismatch exception. So if I expand this, you can see it says that the specified idempotent token was used with different request parameters within the same period. So this is because I've added in an extra property and the requests don't match exactly the same. So the request parameters has to be exactly the same when you are using the client request token. I hope this helps you to get started using transactions and TransactWriteItems in DynamoDB. Let me know in the comments below if you want to see a video on the TransactGetItems and see how it behaves and use it from your .NET application. Thank you, and see you soon in the next video.